Okay, hello. Welcome to the Hafey Digital Podcast pre-show. This is the part of the show where we go through and do our systems checks, make sure everything is up and running. This is a part of the show you will not hear on the audio version. It's exclusive to YouTube. And it is Sunday. What is today? Sunday. Up on Twitch. Okay, good. Sunday, June 6th. Is the day today. Getting a little bit of a, not really a late start, just not quite as prepared and ready once I hit the stream button. So we're just going to hang out for a little bit. Hope everybody's having a good day. Today is fight day for the Floyd Mayweather or Logan Paul fans. They're doing their exhibition down in Miami today. That should be an interesting event. They do have some good fights on there as well. Jarrett Hurd's coming back to the scene. Interested in seeing what he's going to be doing. Let's see. All right, no drop frames. That's awesome. Looks like we are up on YouTube. Twitch just came on my phone. Looks like we are up on Twitter. Looks like we are up on Facebook. Let's check our camera angles here. Boom, boom. Fantastic. Got a couple little surprises today. And I think you'll like today's episode. We got a lot of information to cover. And it is episode 79. So let's see. Audio looks good. Sound effects potted up. Gonna need those today. Cameras all on and up and running. And I think with that, we're good. Now, things are a little bit different today with the intro. So I could, there's a very good chance that I may mess this up. So we will see. Let me refresh this and see if we got anybody back here. The old YouTubes. Excuse me. Okay. Today's episode number 79. Fantastic. All right, let's see if I can get this right. Hello and welcome to the Creative Control Room podcast. I did mess that up because I forgot the episode number. Hello and welcome to episode number 79 of the Creative Control Room podcast, a show for creators, makers, and doers where my goal is to help you make to the max. I'm your operator, Ryan Hafey, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about what camera you should buy as a new or beginning photographer. Let's get into it. We don't have a full intro yet, but we do have a preview of what I've been working on so far. So without further ado, this is the current version of the intro. Here you go. Hey, there we go. So that's kind of what we're working on. There's still a lot to do with that intro. It's not anywhere near complete. I have some things that I'm still trying to figure out what to do with. The logo animation, there's a lot of tweaking that I need to do, but that's kind of the general concept that I'm looking for. I'm a little stuck at this point as far as what to do next. I know I want to animate the little buttons, the little colored squares that are in there, kind of give it more of a control room-esque feel. But it's coming along, and I, obviously, this is not going to be the sound that you hear behind the intro when it's done. Still working on the music, and actually, now that I think about it, I'm probably not going to do music. I think I may do just some kind of cinematic sounding, sound design, soundscape of some kind, using some of those Adobe sound effects. Oh, I'm tangled down here, cables and stuff all over the place. So. I may do that with like a little voiceover of some kind, the Creative Control Room podcast. I don't know. I'm still working on it, but that's kind of where the animation is at. I've learned a lot making that, just as far as like how the camera effect works and like the light effect, using synthetic lighting within After Effects and 3D and stuff like that. So it's been a fun process. I didn't get to put quite as much effort towards that this week as I wanted to. But we're gonna keep plugging away at it, and we're gonna make it work. By the way, if you are new here, my name is Ryan Hafey. I am the operator of the Creative Control Room podcast, And I talk about all things related to content creation, whether it be photography, video creation, talk about FPV drone flying every now and then, podcasting, obviously, live streaming, basically whatever your creative endeavor may be. I talk about it, and I also document the different projects that I happen to be working on and share any knowledge that I may have here as well. So if any of that interests you and you're not already subscribed, it would be fantastic if you would hit that subscribe button wherever you happen to be watching or listening. And be sure to follow me on social media at Ryan Hafey on Instagram and Twitter. Thank you so much for being here. So, okay, first of all, quick update on the studio that I'm building that I mentioned last week. So, as I mentioned, we purchased about $5,000 worth of studio equipment, everything from cameras to really most of the expense was cameras and accessories. If you're interested in knowing about what exactly I purchased, I mentioned the entire list on last week's show, so that full list is there. And this week was spent basically getting that studio up and running for a show tonight. So the setup, as far as how that studio setup is very similar to this one. Obviously, different cameras in different places and things like that. But 4 cameras, all the cameras we use are this one right here. They're looking great. This is the Sony ZV-1. 4 cameras. We're going to have a setup to where we'll be able to live stream with it. We'll be recording directly into the computer using OBS when we get things up and running. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm a little nervous because even though I'm familiar with the setup, anytime you try to produce a new show, well, it's not a new show. It's been going on for a little while, but this will be the first time we're producing it in this fashion in this studio. You know, I'm pretty used to the format that I'm working with here, but the show flow is a little bit different over there. So sure, there'll be a little bit of a learning curve, but that's part of the fun of it. And I've been over there the last few days putting the studio together, and that's I love doing that stuff. I love just kind of building things out like that and troubleshooting issues that come up. That's where I thrive. So lots of fun there. Looking forward to it. So yes, the main topic for today. So this episode is for new or aspiring photographers who maybe already have a camera and are looking to upgrade, or you just want to buy your first camera. And the reason I wanted to mention this is I was just kind of thinking over the week of what to talk about in this episode. And I realized that I've seen this comment on my videos that I've put out online. I've seen this comment on social media posts, especially on like Facebook pages dedicated to, content creation and like the No Small Creator community. There's a lot of people there that are often, many of them are new to content creation and just kind of are still learning. And the question that a lot of people ask, and it drives me nuts every time I see it, is what camera should I buy? It's such a broad question to ask, and it puts all the burden of finding context on the person being asked or on everyone else. What camera should I buy is you need so much more information than that. What are you trying to shoot? Are you trying to shoot photography? Are you trying to shoot video? Are you shooting landscapes? If you're doing photography, you're doing landscapes, you're doing sports photography, you're doing astrophotography, you're doing portraits, headshot, studio work. So many questions that need to be asked. So I think asking what kind of camera should I buy is the wrong question to be asking. I think if you are getting into, and by the way, we are going to be focusing on photography specifically for this video. I was going to do like half and half, where it was like, okay, these are the camera features that you might want to think about if you are into photography. These are for video, and do that in one episode. But as I was going through all the features, there are a lot of features to go through. So what I think I'll do is focus on photography today, and then next week, depending on how this goes, maybe we'll do the video, the list of video features. But what I think people need to be doing if they're interested in purchasing or upgrading their current camera is not asking what camera they should be buying. It should be, here's what I want to do. Here's the kind of photography I want to shoot. What cameras should I look for and what camera features, are important. What camera features would be important to someone who wants to shoot the type of photography I do, and what should I look for? And then from that, with that information, you should go and do research and find a camera that accommodates all those different features that you're looking for. So I may reference specific cameras in this episode, depending on the feature that I'm talking about, but I'm not going to be recommending any specific cameras that you should be using. Again, it's all going to vary. I'm also not going to say, okay, if you're a landscape photographer, you should get this camera. If you're a sports photographer, you should get that camera. I'm not going to be doing that. I'm going to basically be going through a list of features that I believe are important if you are a photographer. So some of these features may not be relevant to you based on the type of photography you want to shoot, but it's still good to have an understanding of what some of these features are, how they work, and how you might be able to use them based on the type of photography you do. So without further ado, let's get started and just kind of go down the list here. And this is really in no particular order. And some things I may gloss over if they're features that are commonly found in pretty much every modern camera today. But let's just get started and see where we get with this. So, for starters, image formats. Again, we're talking specifically photography features here, so I'm not going to be going over video. But image formats. Most cameras that you buy these days are going to be able to shoot JPEG. What you really want, especially if you are going to have a focus on quality, is cameras that can shoot in a RAW format. Again, most modern day cameras, over a couple $100 are going to give you the option to shoot in RAW. Even some smartphones now allow you to shoot in RAW. But shooting in RAW is going to give you the ability to adjust your photos with more freedom to play around with some, the highlights and the shadows. JPEGs are essentially compressed versions of your images, and RAW is basically all the uncompressed data. So you can do a lot more in adjusting the colors and the exposure and everything with RAW photos or RAW images than you can with JPEGs. And then there's also other formats like HEIF, which is a high efficiency something. I'm not sure what the acronym is, but I think like Apple devices allow you to shoot or shoot with this type of codec now, and I think they're introducing it into some cameras. But JPEG and RAW are kind of the big ones. So if you want the ability to do some post-production and some touch-ups, you want to make sure you have a camera that can shoot in RAW. Let's go to resolution and megapixels. So this will vary, again, depending on what you want to shoot. Now, if you're someone who wants to shoot, let's say, landscape photography, and you want to take those photos and blow them up, print them out, put them, in a big frame up on your wall, something like that, you will want a camera that's going to give you more megapixels. It's going to give you a higher resolution. So versus, let's say, like when I do in boxing, when I shoot a boxing match, at the end of the night, I'm quickly processing those photos and getting them out to media. Now, most of the time, there's no need to send out photos that are, huge files and massive, because an editor for a website that wants to do a recap on a fight may just take a photo and they're going to resize it down anyway. So for most digital purposes, what I do, it's not going to require super high resolution. But, again, if you want to do print or anything like that, high resolution may be more applicable to you. So just to give a couple of examples, you've got the Sony a7S III, which is kind of the new flagship from Sony that especially video creators are raving over and have been for a little while now. The sensor on that camera is 12.1 megapixels versus the Sony a7R2 or R3, I can't remember, one of the two. But either way, that camera has a 42.4 megapixel sensor. So your resolution with the A7R2 or 3, whatever it was, is going to be much greater than that of the Sony a7S III. Now, the Sony a7S III obviously is more intended for video creators. But again, if you don't need that high resolution and you also have interest in creating video, then the Sony a7S III may be a good camera for you. You can still take photos with it. They're just not going to have as high a resolution as they would if you got something like the A7R2. So that's resolution / megapixels. Robert in the chat. What's going on, Robert? Sensor size. Let's move on to sensor size. So this one can get a little complicated. So, obviously when you have your cell phone's camera, it's going to have a little tiny sensor because, the lens is only this big, and obviously the sensor's got to be basically just as big behind that. So tiny little sensors in your phone cameras. You have cameras like this one here and this one here, both of which I believe are micro four thirds. They might be crop. I can't remember off the top of my head. And then you have a step up from micro four thirds is a crop sensor camera, which is what this is. And then you have full frame size sensors, which is kind of like the equivalent to 35 millimeter sensor. And all of them are going to have different features and give you different looks and things like that. Crop sensors, micro four thirds. Again, those sensors are going to be smaller than a full frame sensor. An example of a full frame sensor camera would be this, which is the Sony A7 III. But crop sensors, micro four thirds, those sensors will typically do just fine for you. And I mean, you can have cameras that can get up to 4K resolution with the smaller sensors, not a big deal. One of the things that you do give up though, when you go with the smaller sensor is depth of field. So with a bigger sensor, you have it, even with like an f1.8 aperture, you're going to get less depth of field on a smaller sensor versus on a full frame sensor. There's just less sensor size to play with. I don't know all the math behind it, but all you need to know is that if you really want that background separation where everything in the background is kind of blurred out, if that's really important to you, you would want to go with more of a full frame sensor. Full frame sensors are going to be larger as well and typically a little bit more expensive. So if you're on a budget, there's nothing wrong with crop sensors and micro four thirds. Depth of field and those types of aesthetics are typically, unless you're a pixel peeper, most people aren't going to notice the difference, nor will they care. So it's really up to you if the extra cost and that extra bit of buttery smooth depth of field is worth it to you. I have a sensor size. Next, let's move to continuous shooting. So this basically means, does the camera have an option to, shoot in high frames per second when you're shooting photos? So, if you continue to hold down the shutter, is it going to just continue taking photos? And how fast does it do that? Now, if you are someone who is a landscape photographer and you're framing up your shot and you're just getting kind of one photo at a time, a camera that's going to shoot, 12, 15, 20 images in a second, that's not really going to be that important to you. Now on the other side of that, if you are someone who shoots sports photography, you're going to want a camera that can shoot many frames in a short amount of time. Especially, this is really important in boxing. If you can time punches, if I could take one photo of somebody throwing a punch and miss the impact, or as someone starts to throw the punch, I can press down on the shutter, take 5 or 6 photos, and one of them is more than likely going to capture that impact. So it's definitely more important when you are shooting things that move quickly, like sports and things like that. So if that's important to you, make sure you look at the camera specs, see how many photos you can get, again, if that's something important to you. Let's talk about shutter speeds for a little bit. Again, most modern day cameras are going to offer a wide range of different shutter speeds. By the way, the shutter speed determines how much time the sensor is allowed to receive light. So if you've got, imagine the camera sensor behind my hands here, shutter is going to open for a certain period of time and then close. So it determines how long the sensor is exposed to light. If you are, just a couple of examples, if you are an astrophotographer, if you go out and shoot the stars, you are typically going to be working with shutter speeds up to or maybe even beyond 30 seconds. So typically when you think of shutter speed, you think of like, 1/60th of a second, 1/200th of a second, 1/1000th of a second, but you can go much longer than that. And I've done a little bit of astrophotography, and there have been times when I would do an exposure that was 30 seconds long. and that's just to let in as much light as possible in the dark environment that you're in. So if you do shoot some astrophotography, or if you have aspirations to, then you want to make sure the camera that you're going to get is going to be capable of those long shutter speeds. Again, on the opposite end of that spectrum, let's say you have a need to use a super, super high frame rate, whether that be for sports or you're just trying to capture something that's moving very fast, whatever that may be. You just want to make sure that the camera is going to accommodate a very fast shutter speed. Anything above 1/1000th of a second, or whatever it is that might be applicable to you. If you're like a landscape photographer or somewhere in that realm, you're not going to be using any crazy shutter speeds for the most part. So, but just something to keep in mind for depending on what you're shooting. Next is time-lapse features or intervalometers. So the Sony a7 III has a feature like this. Not all cameras do. I think my Canon 7D Mark II, which I had previous to this, I don't believe it had this feature. It may be more common now. I'm not sure honestly, but time lapses or intervalometers basically will allow you to take photos at set intervals for set periods of time. So you could do some kind of a time lapse. Maybe you want to capture a sunset, and you want your camera to be able to take a photo every 10 seconds for 30 minutes. Some cameras have that ability, but if that's something that you want to do or will want to do potentially in the future, again, another spec to look for and make sure that the camera offers it if that's what you want. Now there's autofocus points. Autofocus points. So when you look into through the viewfinder of a digital camera, oftentimes you will see a little square. Sometimes if you're just shooting with wide, you can use automatic features where the camera kind of determines what it thinks you're trying to focus on. But if you really want to get granular about it, what I like to do when I shoot photography, especially any like portrait photography or also in boxing, is I will set a small focus point, and you can move it around in the viewfinder, but you set a small focus point somewhere in the viewfinder, then you put that focus point on whatever you're trying to focus on, get your focus, reframe, and then take your photo. In boxing, when I typically shoot boxing, I will have the autofocus point on either the right third of the frame or left third of the frame, and then I will keep it locked on one of the fighters in the ring, and then when I'm ready to shoot, I'll just press down on the shutter. So if having newer cameras have a lot of those autofocus points, which is great because you could set up if your subject in your frame is up in the top right corner of your framing, then you can put an autofocus point up there, get your focus, and then just kind of shoot, get your shot. But if having a lot of those autofocus points is important to you, make sure you look and see how many autofocus points your camera will have. Did I include anything else on that? Let's see. Nope, that was it. Another is silent shooting. Does your camera... Will you have a need to shoot silently? So, actually, I wonder. Let's see if I can illustrate this. So, this is my Sony a7 III. Right now, if I were to take a photo, it would... Oh, hold on. No, that's right. It sounds like that. Now, if I want to shoot silently, I could do that, and it would sound like this. Literally nothing. And that's helpful, let's say, if you're at a quiet event, or there's someone maybe presenting in a room and you don't want to make a bunch of click-clacking noise when the room is super silent. Having a silent shooting feature could be super helpful. The downside that I noticed, and this was something that I didn't realize until recently actually, is that at least with the Sony a7 III, the way that silent shooting works, you don't get any of that flicker removal. So there are some lighting situations you'll be in where the lights will flicker at sort of the same rate as your shutter speed. So we don't typically see it as we're just moving around in daily life, but typically speaking, unless you have some sort of cinema quality lighting setup, the lights in whatever room you're in are probably flashing and flickering at a rate that you can't perceive with the human eye, but that's how lights typically operate. It's just this very, very fast flickering. And when you shoot with silent silent mode, again, at least in this case on the A7 III, it disables the flicker removal feature, which helps with that. So you got to be careful with that. But, and there may be, and I'm not sure I'm sure there probably are some cameras that have silent shooting with flicker removal these days because the technologies keep getting better and better. But again, something to consider. But if that's for you, yeah, you want to make sure that the camera can take photos silently. Flash photography. Are you doing anything with flash? Are you going to be shooting any portraits or any events that would require flash photography? If so, are you comfortable with shooting, with a built-in flash? Just the ones that pop up off the top of the camera. If that's okay for you, you're not, it's probably not going to give you the best results compared to, let's say, using an on-camera speed light or some off-camera flashes. But, this camera, the Sony A7 III, does not have a built-in flash. So if you intend to use a built-in flash, make sure the camera has it. Also, with relation to that, if it doesn't have a built-in flash, you want to make sure that you have some kind of a hot shoe on it or something that you could put an external speed light on. Actually, I think all these cameras do. But there are some, especially like the smaller, more pocket-friendly cameras, may not always have a hot shoe on the top. And the hot shoe is just where you would put in the speed light, attach the speed light to. And the hot shoe would basically create an electrical connection between the camera and the speed light so that when you take the picture on the camera, it'll activate the speed light. But again, a lot of the smaller cameras, not a lot of them, but some of the smaller cameras may not have it if you're just looking for a little point and shoot. So if that's important to you, if you want to be able to put an external flash on your camera, make sure that that is on your list of features. Next up, let's talk about viewfinders. So going back to the A7 III, this has a live view on the back of the camera. Also, you can adjust it to where it has just EVF here, and EVF meaning electric viewfinder. What I will say about this is I find live view is helpful, again, using my boxing experience. It's helpful in boxing photography because oftentimes, I'm a little bit on the taller side. I'm about 6 foot, which means that when I'm shooting ringside, it's kind of hard for me to get down low enough. Sometimes commissions are really picky and they want you to stay and shoot beneath the first rope, which can sometimes be difficult for me. So with like the Sony, using live view, I can turn off the EVF, just turn on live view, and then flip up this screen, and then just kind of hold the camera down here, looking in my live view and seeing what I'm shooting. Now, I will say, and I don't know if it's any different now, but Canon cameras, for example, the live view on those is not very good. You aren't able to do the same things that you would be able to do if you were looking through the viewfinder. It might be different on some of their mirrorless options. I'm honestly not sure. But yeah, I would say if having a viewfinder and having the ability to be able to shoot without looking through a viewfinder is important to you, just make sure that you're going to have the same functionality shooting using the viewfinder versus shooting through sorry, I keep calling it viewfinder. This is on the back, this is live view, and then through here would be either through the viewfinder or the EVF, electronic viewfinder. But you would just want to make sure that you can shoot the same way using live view as you would shooting using the EVF, aka viewfinder. There you go. Wi-Fi transfer. Do you have a need to be able to offload photos quickly and send them out to whoever needs them? Like if you're at an event and people need a quick turnaround on photos, do you have the ability to transfer them directly off of your phone and to send them out? If you have the need for that, then you want to make sure that your camera is going to have Wi-Fi capabilities. I will also tell you that the Sony A7 III does have Wi-Fi capabilities. However, there's 2 limitations to that. One being you can transfer your photos directly to your phone, but the resolution is going to be much smaller than if you just transferred the photos directly onto a computer from the SD card. Also, I mean, unless you want to take the time to open those transferred photos into, Lightroom on your phone, or just edit the colors a little bit in your photo app on your phone, you're gonna that you have to take that into account basically. Otherwise, you're just going to be stuck with whatever processing is coming, the camera has done to the photo. So if you're fine with how the photos look in camera and you want to transfer them to your phone and you're okay with the lower resolution, in that case, you should be fine. To my knowledge, there are no cameras that are going to allow you to transfer the full resolution JPEG wirelessly. Again, could be wrong there. But again, that's why it's important to do the research. I shouldn't tell you, I don't want to sit here and tell you, go find a camera with Wi-Fi capabilities so you can transfer them onto your phone for a quick turnaround without, explaining the drawbacks of Wi-Fi transfer or potential drawbacks of it. So that's Wi-Fi transferring. Okay, next up, operating temperature or temperature tolerance. This is a big one, at least as of late. I feel like with every new camera that comes out, there's always someone mentioning how a camera overheats really quickly. Now, to be fair, I think this is mostly related to video. Most people experience temperature issues or like overheating when it comes to video. Although, again, if you're shooting something where you're just laying on that shutter a whole bunch, there's potential for the camera to overheat for sure. So if you know that you're going to be in hot environments, or if you know you're going to be shooting a lot of photos back to back, make sure that your camera is going to have a high enough heat tolerance to not shut down on you after a little bit of use, because that could be a pain in the ass, because then you have to let the camera sit and cool down, whatever. Like the Sony a6500 has a tendency to overheat, especially when shooting in 4K for extended periods of time. The Sony ZV-1, I haven't had any issues with overheating so far. And this is obviously a newer camera versus this one, so it just kind of depends on the camera. But some of the newer Sonys, especially like the Sony a7 III, has not the overheating issues were very minimal from what I had seen. So something to look at if that fits your use case. What's next? We got battery life. This is a big one. The battery life on the Sony a6500 here is terrible. The batteries are tiny and they don't last very long. Battery life on the Sony a7 III back here is actually not bad. I can get by with, just using a fighter camp visit as an example. I can typically get through a camp visit, which is usually a few hours, with one battery. I usually switch to a second one just as a safeguard, so the first one doesn't just run out in the middle of a video shoot or whatever. With photography, battery life, not as big of an issue, I would say, when it comes to that versus video, unless you're shooting for super long extended periods of time and you're shooting a lot of photos. But nobody likes to have to change their battery super frequently anyway, and nobody wants to have to spend a bunch of money on a bunch of extra batteries. So I would think, personally, that a good battery life is an important feature, whether or not you shoot photo or video. So look for something that's got a good battery life. Weight and size. So this is interesting. You have to determine what size camera you want. Are you willing to carry around something like this, which is kind of big and heavy? And of course, this looks a little bit bigger because I've got a cage on the outside of it. But it's got a big lens on it. It's got a big body. It's kind of heavy. It'd be cumbersome to just carry this around all the time. You definitely want to have a camera strap. You can't put this in your pocket by any means, but this feels heavy in the hands. You feel like you have a lot of control over it. And typically some of these larger cameras, it's usually an indication of better quality, or at least a bigger sensor. So is this something you want to carry, or would you rather carry a little guy like, I don't know if you can see it, like something like this, that could, if you wanted to, you could fold that up and put it in your pocket, and then be able to pull it out and be up and running in no time. So think about what size camera you're going to be willing to deal with, and factor that in, because some cameras are bigger than others, especially the old DSLRs. Well, let's say old. They're still making some, but they're kind of being phased out. But DSLRs are typically going to have bigger body sizes than mirrorless cameras. Something to keep in mind. Weight, size, okay. Lens options. Again, do you want something like this Sony ZV-1 here that's got a fixed lens on it that has a equivalent 24 to 70 millimeter focal length? Or do you want something like this where you can change out the lens and have a little bit more versatility when it comes to the lens? There's pros and cons to each. The pros to this, obviously, right now I've got a 16 to 35 millimeter lens on here. If I wanted to, I could take this off and put my 24 to 70 millimeter lens on there, or I could put a 135 millimeter lens on here. The options are endless, although each one of these lenses is going to cost just as much, if not more, than the camera body itself in many cases. So lots of flexibility, but it's going to be way more expensive and a lot more weight versus, again, getting something like the Sony ZV-1 and just operating within the focal length that it comes with, which is 24 to 70. And that's kind of like the golden focal range, I guess. That's for most people, 24 to 70 is a great focal range that'll get you pretty far. So if you need convenience and something compact and something just ready out of the box, that might be for you. If you need that flexibility, then you want to find something that maybe has some lens, some interchangeable lens capability. Also, with that, you want to look for a camera system that's going to have a lens selection that will suit your needs. Now, Sony's historically was not that great, but Sony's built out their lens line quite a bit. Canon's has always been pretty robust, but there are some camera makers that don't have the best camera lineup, and you might, in that case, have to go with a third-party lens, say with something from Tamron or Sigma, or maybe get an adapter. But anytime you do that, you typically lose a little bit of that functionality versus using any proprietary lenses of that camera maker. So, and also look into as well, typically speaking, how expensive are lenses for, Sony lenses versus buying Canon for Canon lenses, and just take a look at some of the options to make sure that you are going to be able to get the lenses that you need for the system that you have, and that you're not going to be spending an arm and a leg to do it. All right, next, articulating screen. So this Sony a6500 does not have an articulating screen, which is why I have this tiny little monitor behind it. However, the Sony ZV-1 here does have a little articulating screen on it, which is very helpful if you're going to be taking any self-portraits, for example, or you'll be photographing yourself, or maybe you want to be able to quickly kind of show whoever you're photographing what their framing looks like. You can flip that out. This is also very helpful too when it comes to video, which we'll get into most likely next week. But for video, for vlogging, seeing what's in frame is always helpful. So is that important to you? Great. If not, like the Sony, or there's kind of like the hybrid where you have a screen that kind of pops out like this, but won't pop out to the side. It really all depends. If you plan to be behind the camera at all times and you have no interest in doing anything in front of the camera or showing people what they're seeing, then something like this might work or just be just fine for you. Although I will say a lot of these newer cameras these days are including the flip out screens more and more, which a lot of people are happy about. So whether you like it or not, the camera that you end up deciding on may have that. GPS. This one's a little bit more niche, but some people, especially if you shoot landscapes and you want to be able to kind of document where you, if you want to be able to document where you're taking your photos, having a GPS feature on the camera could be helpful. So we got Robert Lazarte Jr. chiming in. I'm glad I get to hop in your live. Thanks, man. Thanks for being here. So yeah, GPS, I mean, if it's important to you to know and to be able to, like EXIF data, for example, is the data that's collected anytime you take a photo. So if you have a photo and you look at its EXIF data, it'll tell you certain things like what shutter speed you shot with, and that's EXIF, by the way. What your shutter speed was, aperture, your ISO, and other, copyright data if you set that up on the camera. And if GPS info is available, it will show you the GPS data or GPS coordinates, so you can know exactly where that photo was taken on planet Earth. Some cameras have it, some don't. If that interests you, make sure you keep that in mind. Connections, meaning, for example, let's see if I can do this here. So obviously different cameras are going to have different connection ports, and they're all going to, serve different purposes. I don't like these flaps on this Sony a7 III, but these are all the different connections that it has, and that's really not a flattering camera angle for that, so I'm going to change back here. But this one has a headphone jack. It's got a mic jack. It's got a micro HDMI jack. It's got a USB-C and a micro USB, and they all do different things. For me, what's important, typically speaking, at least on the photography side, would be some kind of output like a micro USB or a USB-C. If you like to shoot tethered, you want to make sure that you have a port that will allow you to shoot into a computer. Shooting tethered basically just means you can hook your camera up to a laptop or PC or whatever it may be, and as you take your photos, they will load into the computer. Let's see what else. Yeah, USB-C connections could also be helpful when it comes to like wireless or external charging. So all the cameras that I have in my studio here are plugged in via micro USB, and which means they can all receive power through that port. Some of them charge more continuously than others. This camera will actually run down in charge if I use it long enough, versus the Sony ZV-1 here, which will continuously charge as long as I have it plugged in there. So depending on what you want to do, just make sure you've got the right ports for the job. And that was kind of it of the main features. Other things like aperture. Aperture is going to be controlled by the lens, or what range of aperture you have will be controlled by the lens, unless you have something like the Sony ZV-1, which is a fixed lens, and it's going to have the aperture range baked in. So other things like that are going to be pretty common. Exposure settings. Most cameras are going to have different automatic and a manual mode. So, you'll have a shutter priority mode, which means that you can set your shutter speed and let the camera choose what's appropriate as far as aperture and ISO. You can do aperture priority, which is the same, but just with aperture, and then the camera decides what shutter and ISO you should be using. Those are included in most cameras. Aspect ratios, meaning the aspect ratio of what you want to shoot. Most cameras by default will shoot a 3:2 aspect ratio, but maybe you want to shoot 1:1, or maybe you want to shoot 16:9 to kind of match like the typical 1920 by 1080 video dimensions. Whatever that may be, if that's important to you, look into that as well. But typically speaking, you'll have a few different options of those no matter what camera you get. And then metering modes. This is something that I personally don't use a lot of. Changing the meter modes, I just kind of use a multi-meter mode. But basically what this does is this will, if you use any sort of automatic exposure features, when you capture exposure on your camera, using, let's say, a center weighted metering mode. Let's just use that for example. That's a common one. Center weighted metering mode will mean that whatever you're pointing your camera at, whatever towards the center of that frame, that's what the camera is going to base its exposure on. Versus, let's say, like a multi, where it's going to kind of take kind of an average of the entire, what's coming in, of the amount of light that's coming into the camera. It's going to kind of take an average of that to base the exposure off of that. Versus, a spot metering, which I guess would be kind of like center weighted, but you can pick a various spot for where you want the exposure to be drawn from. And there's different uses for different metering modes. If that's important to you, there you go. Just but again, most cameras are going to have those features put in place. So that's a long list. I'm gonna quickly recap the list of features I just went through here. Not going to get into them, but just so you kind of have a list of all these things in a row, and you can figure out from there whether or not they're important to you. But we have image formats like JPEG, RAW, resolution, megapixels. You have sensor size. You have continuous shooting. shutter speeds, time lapse or intervalometer features. You have autofocus points, silent shooting option, flash photography, viewfinders and EVS viewfinder/EVF versus live view. You have Wi-Fi transfer abilities. You have operating temperature or temperature tolerance, however you want to look at that. Battery life, the weight and size of the camera itself. Do you want different lens options? Do you want an articulating screen? Do you have a need for GPS coordinates to be baked into your photo data? Does the camera that you're looking for have the connections that you need, whether it be HDMI, USB-C, etc.? And that's about it. So I hope that was helpful for someone. I hope you're able to listen to that and say, oh, I didn't think about that particular feature. I want to shoot photos that may benefit from having that feature in a camera. I'm going to write that down and make sure that the camera that I decide on has that feature included. I hope I was able to do that for you today. And if I was, and if you're still here with me, it would be awesome if you would hit that subscribe button wherever you happen to be watching or listening, and be sure to follow me on social media at Ryan Hafey on Instagram and Twitter. I'm always happy to answer questions, or, if you just want to stop by and say hello, feel free to do that as well. I'm always hanging out over there. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and call this one done. We still don't have an outro, so we're going to do the usual, or at least the usual for the last couple episodes. I'm going to leave you with a random sound effect, and we're going to fade to black. But keep on creating, making, and doing. We will see you in the next one.